All right, and we're live. Hello, YouTube. So this is the first time doing a revisit of a previous topic for the live stream. Just do a quick revisit of these live streams and sort of the goal and how they'll be structured. So the live streams themselves, the goals are to provide information about Wikilection and then to help improve the overall design, the things that we're planning on doing with it, as well as refine the explanation, get better at the messaging itself, figure out what topics to cover, or maybe those topics that are too complex to really try to explain. There's a number of different topics. Today's are the foundation or the core of Wikilection. There's a few others, and then we'll cycle back to this one. The general idea is we present the topic in the current state. So based on the available sort of information and design that is available, then answer questions, either live in the stream or as feedback is received afterwards. And based on that feedback, we want to refine the plans, so tweak the design, adjust how things are explained, that kind of thing. And then finally, when that topic comes around the next time, we'll repeat that again, but with the new improvements. So especially in this session, we'll be talking about evidence. The main goal of Wikilection is to use evidence to fight misinformation. That's kind of a really high-level summary of what the overall goal for this project is. In the context of that statement, using evidence to fight misinformation, evidence refers to anything that can help prove something is true. That generally means, if we look at our sources of information, whether that's the news or scientists or politicians or whoever is claiming something to be true or trying to figure out what it is, it's the types of information that we have available, and that kind of as a society, we've agreed that these are the things that we turn to figure out, what's true, and possibly if we're hearing conflicting information, which side is telling the truth. So some obvious examples here are scientific reports. So when the science community does some experiments, the actual results of those experiments. There's eyewitness testimony and the kinds of things that journalists would use as evidence. There's video interviews where it's actually the person in question, sitting down and saying things. So that could sort of be another version of eyewitness testimony. And then you can have things like court records or legislation history, that kind of thing. So to talk about the overall core of Wikilection, first we're going to look at the existing model. So how is information presented right now? And then we'll look at how we can improve that. So to start with, we're talking about the public, which is us. So the goal of the public in this context is that we need to understand what's going on in the world. So as sort of the previous slide stated, we're trying to understand what's true, especially in cases where there's conflicting information being presented. Now, there's many different types of evidence, so this can make things a bit complex when the average person, and that's all of us in various contexts, are average in one form or another in different topics. We need the ability to understand complex information from a variety of disciplines. So whether that's science, economics, legislation, that type of thing. And as this says here, everyone is a member of the public, even experts. So if there's an expert economist that's brought out to talk about some new economic principle, well, if the conversation shifts to science, that economist is probably still going to need a scientist to explain some or all of the sort of deeper scientific information being discussed. Now, the public gets information from channels, and the channels are responsible for producing content to provide the important or interesting information to the public. And a part of that is they also act as a filter. There's a ton of stuff going on out there. We couldn't realistically talk about it all. So part of that, of the purpose of a channel, is to decide what's important and then provide the information to discuss why it's important and what's actually happening and possibly what our options are. So some examples of channels as they exist now, that's things like national TV news, right? So in the US, that can be Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, that kind of thing. There's your local radio. So if you have, some local radio news, that still counts as a channel. The more, I guess you could say, modern types of channels are things like YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, that kind of thing. Any type of information source that's, doing some work to tell a story or to relay information and provide that to an audience is a channel in this context. Now, the challenges with this approach, the kinds of areas that channels can go wrong, if you will, there's selective omission. As we said, there's a lot going on. You can't talk about everything. And sometimes you can see certain channels will avoid talking about something if it doesn't fit into their narrative or the kind of story that they're trying to, the kind of picture they're trying to paint about how the world is. There's sensationalizing, where you're taking something that maybe is a non-issue and trying to hype it up, either because you have nothing to talk about or because that sensationalized version does fit into the narrative that channel is trying to build. And finally, one of the things that we'll get to in the next step is, in order to talk about complex topics, channels are often required to bring in experts. And this can even be things like journalists that are, used to help tell a story and verify things just for a regular news segment. Or if you get into talking about science and legislation, the experts involved there. When they're bringing in experts, it's possible that they're ineffective. So that might be that you bring in somebody because they're a scientist, but you're talking about advanced genetics or nanotechnology or something, and the scientist that was brought on, that's not their discipline. They might still be able to speak to it somewhat, but if you get into the really in-depth stuff, they might be out of their element. And sometimes you can have experts that are either knowingly dishonest, or they're just sort of, which we'll get to in the next slide, letting their bias come through. So if we go now to talk about experts. So the experts are the individuals that are explaining and or discussing these complex topics. If you're going to be talking about something and you're presenting yourself as an expert, you're generally assumed to have some kind of a level of expertise or experience in that topic. So if somebody is brought on to, a channel to discuss science, I think the audience would generally think that person has some sort of a scientific background, or at least some sort of a skill set that would mean they should be talking about this. Some examples here, we have scientists, of course, brought out to discuss scientific principles. There's politicians, or especially if they're talking about legislation, but you'll commonly see politicians comment on things to do with the economy and science and industry and all sorts of things that, if they're talking about it, one might assume that, they have some expertise and they're qualified to be talking about that topic. You can bring out economists, and then journalists, of course, if we're talking about current event and news, they're the experts involved there to sort of say, why do we think this thing happened? And that's also the journalists that are conversing with the other experts. So if you're a science journalist and you specialize in that, you're both looking at it from a journalism aspect and science. So you probably have some amount of expertise in both. Now, with this approach of using experts to sort of explain the topics and dive deeper into the evidence, our challenges there include biased reporting, and that's referring to sort of their beliefs. So that is, they're seeing the world through some sort of a biased lens, and that can seep into how they report on things. Something that's fairly similar as well is conflict of interest. And this is talking more like their connections, their source of income, that kind of thing. So if somebody is making their money off a topic, people might be concerned that maybe they're not giving the full story, or it's a bit skewed towards, to benefit their current position. And then finally, as we talked about in the last slide, you can have people with irrelevant skills. Just because somebody is a scientist doesn't mean that they're an expert who can, talk in depth accurately about any topic to do with science. Sometimes it is more specialized. And when we're talking about the evidence itself, and that's kind of really at the core of everything here, these are the types of information that we use to determine if something is true. And that generally involves some kind of an expertise to either verify the information and or to reference it. So if we're talking about like a journalist, their job is to figure out what's true or not based on their sources. And you'll hear about journalists that figured out the story wasn't true as they, dug deeper into their sources and tried to verify them and qualify them. And then the expectation there is that hopefully we're only seeing the actual channels in the content that has been verified. And we've talked about the types of examples for evidence. So that's things like scientific reports, legislation, court records, that kind of thing. And the challenges there include to verify it. If there's, two different copies of a scientific report and they're different, how do we verify which is the original? And just all the information behind the evidence that we need to know. Is the evidence being accurately referenced? So generally speaking, when we see evidence being discussed in a media through a channel, they aren't just going to throw the whole scientific report up on screen and have you read it. They're going to sort of cherry pick or go through and highlight the really important things you need to know. And sometimes, whether intentional or not, that can lead to evidence being summarized in an inaccurate way. So for example, if somewhere deep in the report it says 38% of people do X, well, that might be accurate, or it might seem accurate to reference, but then if you actually read the report, that might be 10% of the original group did this and then 38% of them did it. So saying 38% of people, even though that number shows up in the report, might not be true or accurate. And then finally, just because you're discussing a piece of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting the full picture. It's not uncommon for there to be multiple types or multiple pieces of evidence within the same category or to do with the same story. And sometimes they conflict with each other. And so you can, say if there's 10 pieces of information, one of them disagrees with the other 9. If you just show that one piece of evidence that's disagreeing with everything, it can seem legitimate, even though most signs are pointing to that side's not the winning side. They actually don't have proper evidence to back up their claims. So with all that information about how evidence is presented, what are the possible solutions? What can we actually do about this? So in this case, we'll actually reverse the order that we're talking about things. So we'll talk about evidence first. So first is the community review. And this is community experts will review the evidence itself. So this means, if it's a scientific report, people who know about ideally that specific kind of science. But this is an area where even scientists on sort of unrelated scientific disciplines might still be able to help and say, was this experiment properly designed? Did they break any rules that sort of all scientists agree should be followed? If so, what were those rules, etc. And then the type of the review is tailored to that type of evidence. So the kinds of rules that you'd be following to review a scientific report, they're going to be different than if you're reviewing legislation or journalist sources to say if a current event actually happened or not. The other thing that we'd be interested to track is who created that piece of evidence. This is a scientific report. Who are the scientists involved, and who's the organization that sort of organized and quite possibly paid for it? And by tracking the people and the organizations involved in that creation, we can help ensure that qualified people were involved, and as well that there's no sort of conflicts of interest, or at the very least they're highlighted so people know when they're reading something that might be, slightly biased in one way or the other. And then as well, the goal is to track the evidence, or I guess you could say you want to group the evidence that's sort of trying to fulfill the same purpose, and then see which ones agree with each other. So going back to that previous example of 10 pieces of evidence, 9 agree and 1 doesn't. If you're being presented that one piece of evidence that doesn't agree with the rest, that might be fine, but you'd want to know, hey, just so you know, this is the only piece of evidence that is arguing it this way. There's 9 other pieces that actually disagree. So it's just seeing the context of what the full body of evidence overall is showing instead of one individual piece. So next, the experts themselves. So this starts with setting up expert profiles. And this is tracking the experts, or an important distinction here, people claiming to be experts. We want to track those experts that are involved in providing information to the public, so through channels on complex topics. And this includes anybody in the organization involved with telling the story. That's commonly going to be journalists and editors and the people who are actually involved with both the writing of it and the filtering of the information and the story that actually gets exposed to the public in the end. And then as well, any experts that they're consulting with to help explain complex topics. And so that goes back to the examples of, news trying to explain something scientific. They'll bring on a scientist to help explain that. And, journalists or hosts involved would be tracked as experts, but so would that scientist. And the goal here is for each profile, we want as much information as is feasible for each person. So that's going to be things like their education, their career history, where have they worked, what industries, etc. And then on that note, what financial ties. So that again is keeping an eye out for conflicts of interest, and to see, where their money comes from, who's funding them, any, family or friend connections, that kind of thing that might lead to a conflict of interest in certain topics. Now, there is a whole nother part of Wikilection that is based on this core to do with politics. And in this area, politicians will also be treated as experts. And so that means that as politicians are going through, their time in office and through the different election campaigns, they'll make various claims where they'll talk about a certain study, or a certain, a study, whether it's scientific or economic, and they'll, quote stats. And it's to be able to review them acting as an expert if they're talking, about how something is going to affect the economy, referencing the original piece that they seem to be talking about, and then analyzing that claim just like you would, if it was an expert on a TV news show to make a claim, for or against something. We'd still want to qualify that as well and attach that to their profile so we can see how accurate they are. Now, once you have that expert profile, that allows us to track all the various claims made by that expert over time. Then from there, the community can review those for accuracy, and we can start to get a picture of which experts are the most accurate for certain industries. And that's where you might have, a certain scientist might be okay to talk about, the scientific method overall and maybe their specific discipline within science, but they might occasionally branch out into other areas and maybe they aren't as accurate there. So if you're, a biologist commenting on physics, you're still allowed to, of course, but if you're less accurate talking about physics than you are about biology, it's knowing what the person is actually trained in and seeing how accurate they are in that topic. And finally, not finally, because this isn't exhaustive, but also it's to see how the expert's opinion compares to the other in their role, sort of within their industry or within their discipline. So if you get 100 scientists, odds are one is probably going to disagree with the bulk of them. And so it's to see if that scientist writes something, it's to know, A, they're the only one or they're the vast minority of people talking about this. But then we can also compare that to their accuracy. If they're that 1% and, most things they say end up being wrong, that's telling. But if they're the 1% that disagrees with most of their industry and 98% of the time they're right, they might be the person to listen to in that industry, even if they disagree with the other experts. And then finally, we're talking about the channels. Now, this is where it gets flipped on its head a bit, because this is kind of getting rid of the channels in a way, or at least offering a way to bypass them or almost build your own. So this is centered around the content review. And this is where the community reviews for accuracy in reporting. So of course, they'll review the evidence, to see if there's any problems with the evidence. They review both the experts themselves and the claims that they're making to see sort of who's accurate over time. And then they take all that information, and for every story that's put out by a channel, they review it for that same kind of accuracy. So if an expert is brought in for a channel to say a certain story and they make 5 claims in that story, you want to see which of those claims are accurate. And, so you can dig deeper and find out, if 4 to 5 are correct, which one is wrong, that kind of thing, so that you know that as you're reading it. So that's then tracking the claims and the experts involved. And then when they're doing that type of information, they're doing that for individual stories. At some point, we want them to group the supporting content for an individual story. So if you have, a current event happens or a new scientific discovery, and there's 10 different stories from 10 different channels on that topic, we'd want to review all 10 stories, but then also group them together to say, hey, all 10 of these stories are talking about the same thing, which allows us to sort of hopefully come up with some kind of a summary. But then just like with the experts, if you're, the only one in your industry that's saying that and everyone else disagrees, it's to be able to know that when you're reading that article from a certain source. Say, hey, this is, an article on this source, here's how accurate it is. And also here's some other articles on the same topic from other sources, and here's how they all compare to each other. And then over time, as we start to see what kind of information is bubbling up and how it sort of fits into different categories, to not just categorize it, but say it fits in that category, and then people can vote sort of how important things are within each category. And that allows us to do the next step, which is allows the individual members of the public to filter what they're seeing based on their interest. So if you're, not interested in, let's say, business and economics, and you don't list that as one of your interests, the goal is that you shouldn't see much or any of the stories that have to do with that topic. But if you say that you're very interested in, let's say, science or a certain kind of science, it's to start to build, or sorry, to start to show the individual members the information based on what they say they're interested in. And then finally, as we're building this library of the reviewed evidence and the experts and the stories that result in trends per channel, we can start to track the individual channels that discuss certain kinds of topics and get it, in a way, the same kind of a profile that we have for experts. So we can say what this channel tends to discuss, things that, the experts that they are involved with, things they tend to have in common, any bias that becomes apparent after, you've reviewed 10, 100, or 1,000 stories from a news source. You can start to learn trends and start to figure out areas where the review has showed that, they're honest and accurate and as unbiased as reasonably possible. And then in these other areas, maybe not so much. Here's some examples of them being, openly biased. And then start to see that per channel as well. But in a way, the end goal is to use the channel content to support sort of the overall, like trying to summarize if 10 stories about the same event are there, to be able to summarize everything that we've learned from those stories into an event and almost let people build their own channel. So if you have this ocean of content that's made by, every channel that we can get our hands on and all the content that supports it, you can then build your list of what you're interested in and see specialized information. So if all you care about is science, great. You're going to have a bunch of scientific information from a whole bunch of different scientific disciplines and all that information that supports that. Now, this graphic will probably be updated the next time we see it, because I actually just recently restructured a bit of how things are being discussed, but the core principle is still the same, where you have the foundation or the core in the middle that starts off as just being talked about evidence, but really it's going to be everything we talked about today. So from the evidence, experts, the sort of open channel, the build it yourself, and then as well, all of that community review that allows the community to sort of discuss what's accurate, what's not, and what's true and what's not, and what are the different people involved, what are their, their biases and conflicts of interests and expertise and so on. And then the 3 spokes that we're talking about in the future, there's going to be politics, where that is sort of a grouping of the politician history in more detail, as well as individual elections and the choices faced by the voters in those elections. And that's both the people involved in the election as well as any ballot measures, like, Proposition 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. As well, there's going to be, initially, it's just going to be sort of summarized as talking about science, and that is the ability to use the same sort of approach to discuss controversial topics. So we can see all the information that is available around that topic. Some popular examples are vaccines and climate change, where it's to get a collection of all the information available, start to have a discussion around how can we group this information, what sort of questions are we seeing answered, what sort of questions are left unanswered, and start to paint a picture of what information is available, what things are we reasonably certain are true, and what things are we not sure about. And then finally, something that's not really reflected here, but does sort of come out in the wash, is current events. Along with talking about, I was also going to say the science thing, that's not just science as well. We're talking about science because in the first version, that's what we'll be focusing on. But that same principle that we're going to use to review a whole bunch of different scientific papers and see sort of what they agree and don't agree on. The end goal is to use that for things like economic reports and legislation and everything else, to use both the feedback from experts and the community at large to learn and sort of digest and summarize as much as we can about anything controversial. And then finally, the third spoke is essentially news, but sort of a build your own, or you go to a service, in this case, Wikilection, that has an ocean of information. You tell it what you want to know about and what you're interested in, and then it bubbles up the stuff that other people in the community have said, this is in relation to that kind of interest. People who are interested in this will likely find this topic interesting. And it's to start to allow that to be sort of a more trustworthy, truly unbiased news source, because everything that you go and read, it's meant to be a summarized version of all the available news. You can dig deeper into certain channels if you want, but it's to see all the information that the proof actually is available for, where it's not about who can weave the most convincing arguments using words and maybe some stats dropped here and there that aren't verified. It's after all that is reviewed, and we've seen the information and the experts and their biases and the channel and everything involved, what comes out in the wash? What does it seem like is actually going to be where all the evidence and all of the information available is pointing to? So that is the core. That last part definitely needs a bit more building on that messaging and improving it, because that's sort of, just a mouthful of words. But that hopefully provides both the example of what the core or the foundation of Wikilection is and how it helps the other pieces, as well as seeing what those pieces are and sort of why the foundation matters. Because the foundation itself isn't terribly important unless it's supporting these other pieces, to actually start to get a summary of the news and a summary of controversial topics, and to start to build a picture of politicians and people who are running for office, to start to see their history and get a summary of information based on what's available that allows you to dig as deep as you want to see why it's summarizing things and why it's recommending one thing over the other. So I think that's it for today. The current plan for this is to have, it looks like we're going to have 4 topics. If we go back to the start and sort of talk about the general approach to the live streams where we cycle through the topics. So it's going to be this, the foundation or the core of Wikilection, and then those 3 spokes that I just talked about here. So that's the current events, politics, and science. And then we'll likely keep cycling through. Now that might change in the future as well, as we get more interaction and as this messaging gets discussed in a bit more detail. But a couple of the changes that happened here actually just happened like half an hour before this, before we went live here. So the next time we talk about this, it'll probably be even more refined, and these spokes will be a bit more refined because we'll have gone through a cycle of each in the live stream, and that will definitely help hammer that out. So we'll end it in a minute. Thank you for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out on, let me actually scroll down here, on our Facebook page. That's probably the best place to reach Wikilection for now, and that's just facebook.com/Wikilection. You can read what we've been up to there, as well as follow us. And then if you like Patreon and you are involved there, you can also go to patreon.com/Wikilection. And as well, there is a website, wikilection.com, that does have a fair amount of information. And the goal is to keep that updated with sort of the best of the best content, so you don't have to swim through all the content available through Facebook and Patreon and on our YouTube channel. So I will leave you there. Thanks again for your time, and I look forward to clearing this up even more in the future. Thanks. Bye.